we're going to talk about modernisation and migration in this video. So let's start with migration actually. So David.
Yeah, so from an App Connect Enterprise point of view, or IBM Integration Bus, WMB, Message Broker before that, obviously migration normally refers to moving from version to version, going from the different versions, so from 8 to 9, 9 to 10, 10 to 11, etc., all the way through. The latest version is version 12, so really people are now interested in moving from prior versions to version 12, whether that's version 11 or version 10. And we support kind of two different types of migration. You've kind of got basically start it all over again migration, where you configure your new system. We normally call that parallel migration, but we really mean just start again. You set up your new systems, you then deploy all your flows, do all your testing, and that sort of thing. So there's your parallel migration, and you've also got this kind of migration of your existing artifacts. We used to call it in-place migration, a tool called MQSI Migrate Components.
Big bang migration was my favourite term for it.
Big bang migration, that's a good term, because you basically just took your node, your existing configuration, went poof, and hopefully like magic, alakazam, it's turned into your new version successfully.
Big bang migration sounds scary, and you're probably right to be scared when you take that approach.
Definitely. So we don't, we've got a newer version of that based off some extract tooling called MQSI Extract Components, whereby you can take a backup of your original system and then create your new node and configuration from that backup. Did you want to talk some of that, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, if we think about those two different forms of migration, I guess the key difference there is whether or not your starting point is the existing system that's running, or whether your starting point is a whole bunch of artifacts that are checked into version control. So it's always safer to go to the whole bunch of artifacts checked into version control, but that of course relies on you having got the most up-to-date version of all of those artifacts in the place where you expect them to be.
And relies on you having version control.
Well, exactly, yeah.
And actually, one of the great new piece of capability we've added in version 12, in 12.08 and 12.09, is that if you have misplaced your original source, or it's not quite in sync, we have this capability now where you can retrieve your source from your deployed artifacts. So after you've done your migration, the artifacts that are actually deployed are something called DFM XML, and you are able to now retrieve your original .message flow from that DFM XML as of 12.09.
Kind of a reverse engineering, isn't it? It's a pretty good, 95% reverse engineer of that.
It's just really, really handy. It helps with problem determination. You can also view your flows as well in the toolkit. So if you have, even if you have flows deployed as CMF or as DFM XML, you can view them. But I'm going off at a tangent. I just wanted to say something about, since you're talking about source control and if things go out of sync, you have capability now in version 12 to recover that source.
Very much so, yeah. Leave no man behind. Always give a way forward. If we think maybe about, I hesitate to use the term best practice, but my personal best practice, if you were going to go through one of these migrations, I would always start using the environment that you've already got and invoke the MQSI extract components command. And the way that basically operates is it takes a zip file, which is a backup of your existing system, and you can move that backup between different physical machines if you want to move your environment, different architectures. If you wanted to start embracing containers, you could move to an independent integration server architecture if you prefer. And once you run our command against that, that basically ensures that we have all of the environment settings from your previous system. So if there are any pre-existing relationships with particular endpoints, we'd know all about those. And then having done that, that's built your basic system. What I would then encourage folks to do is to go back to their artifacts that are in version control, because of course most people have version control systems available. And in that situation, I would then redeploy those artifacts down. And that ensures, of course, that folks have definitely got the version that was last checked in rather than one that was last deployed.
Yeah, but what you're saying there is also good, because you've got this backup from prior version 10 say, and you'd run all these commands to create this configuration. You'd set your JVM properties, you'd set your socket manager properties, and those were hidden in our internal config formats. If you use something like extract components, then it will create you server conf YAML set, files with those settings in. And you can then take those server conf YAML files and you can put them into source control.
Absolutely.
And they'll create policies as well.
Yeah.
Configurable services that you're using earlier in version 10 and earlier.
Yeah. So I guess that's the main thing that folks have to get to grips with when they start moving on to these new architectures, is the use of policy files. And one thing that magical MQSI extract components command does for you is it generates you policies to match your old configurable services. And it will place all of those into a default policy project. And the great thing about that is that you then don't have to go back into your message flows and start changing around the flow to refer to the policy. That just happens automatically for you. When you run your flow, we will go and look inside that default policy project to find all the definitions that were there previously.
Yeah.
So it makes the migration process very smooth.
It does, yeah. There's also, before you, I mean, stepping back a bit now, is before you actually start migration, you've also got to start thinking about, perhaps what's been removed in newer versions. And there's a few nodes that we've kind of discontinued in version 11, the the STA nodes.
Definitely not the SAP
Definitely
nodes.
not the SAP
They're
nodes,
still around,
yeah. The other S acronyms and the STA nodes. We've got rid of our old mapping nodes, back from pre-version 7.
PHP compute.
PHP compute, yeah. So there's a few gotchas you just want to look out for. That's all in the documentation. So just watch out for some of those gotchas when migrating.
I guess when folks come to migrate, one of the things that they often think about is not only what version of operating system are they going to be deploying on, what physical infrastructure they want to use. So one thing that's obviously coming up a lot in conversation is the move to containers. So we often refer to that as modernisation rather than migration. And that throws up a whole bunch of other questions that the user might want to think about when they come to make one of those major changes.
So there's a great new tool called Transformation Advisor that we provide. Can you talk us through?
Sure, yeah. So as a first step, when you're thinking about getting onto this modernisation journey into containers, one thing that you might want to do is to take a look at your existing estate of deployed artifacts and have somebody tell you whether or not they're suitable for use in a container environment. And that could be many different aspects of that, like whether or not you've got a relationship with a local queue manager, whether you're not using local file interfaces, that kind of thing.
Yeah, because all those kind of things are troubling when you're in containers, because containers are supposed to be short-lived. You can kill it at any point, it'll restart. So you don't really want any state to be stored on the container. You want to be talking, off container to queue managers, to databases, to remote file systems and things like that. So this transformation advisor tooling will actually look through your flows, look through your backups, look through your configuration and say, oh, you're using a local queue manager, you're using it with some aggregation nodes. Here's what we'd recommend for actually changing your flow to do something different.
It's interesting that we pick on the queue manager relationship as one of the most important things, because when folks move into a container environment, we'd typically expect the MQ queue manager definition to be running inside a different container to App Connect Enterprise. And the reason why we always suggest that is it allows you to independently scale ACE from MQ, and in many circumstances also end up with fewer queue managers required within your architecture. You might be able to consolidate your architecture down a little bit there.
And of course, even for those migrating, historically, IIB, WMB, version 9 and earlier, you actually had to have a local queue manager per integration node. So people have generally got, people that have been with us for 15, 20 years, have a queue manager and an integration node kind of next to each other. And maybe that doesn't always the right fit these days, because if you're just using that, if you're not using that integration node for messaging, or you're just using it for storage of messages for aggregation and things like that, you can start to look at your uses of why you're using that local queue manager and say, okay, do I need it local? Can I have it remote? What am I using this for? Can I consolidate onto one queue manager? Things like that.
I suppose it's one thing that folks may not be aware of, but we've now got a setting in our main YAML file, in the server conf YAML file, where you can declare a remote default queue manager. So it's also very
standalone independent server.
For a standalone integration server, an independent integration server, exactly that. And that makes it a lot easier to start adopting some of these features, because you don't have to go back into your actual flows and update them. So by having that remote default queue manager relationship expressed through a policy, for example, makes it quite an easy thing to start using.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things we always aim for when we do some of these migrations and bring these things into it. We don't want people to have to re-engineer their entire flows. So like we've got the thing with the default policy lookup, so you don't have to change all your flows when you move from configurable services to policies. We've got the remote default queue manager there when changing queue managers from local to remote. We've also got things around deploying. So from version 11 onwards, all your message flows and stuff had to be inside applications. We brought applications and libraries out as a concept in version 8, and now from version 11 we said everything has to be in an application. So we've given you 3 versions grace, which is about 10 years. And so we move stuff into the default application during the migration process if you have artifacts deployed without that.
So what sort of advice would you give to customers, Ben, when they're trying to plan their journey from going from traditional deployments to container-based deployments?
Take a deep breath, start early, and I think start exploring in two different ways, both the container platform itself, and IBM's or Red Hat's OpenShift is something that we'd absolutely want to recommend to folks to go off and investigate first. And really that's really about getting familiar with containers as a platform, regardless of whether you're looking to deploy App Connect Enterprise or other products. So we've talked a lot about MQ, but we have separate bundlings these days. We use Cloud Pak for integration in order to provide lots of our different capabilities, all underneath the auspices of a single UX experience, and much of that is driving operators under the covers as well. So we've got ways that make it really easy for the user to start adopting containers. But I think I'd also say is if you're not quite ready for that kind of major jump, maybe first of all thinking about getting recent on version, and even by adopting either version 11 or version 12, hopefully version 12, because version 11 is looking distinctly middle-aged. Not that there's anything wrong with being middle-aged, but
Speak for yourself.
if we take version 12 as maybe a first stepping stone, getting yourself onto that version will automatically prepare you for containers that come later. So getting familiar with the server conf YAML file and the policies and all these other things that we mentioned.
Moving to applications. Yeah, and even you could start thinking about, okay, right, I'm going to create a few more integration servers than I perhaps had at earlier levels, and then deploy certain applications out into these quote containers that are really just another integration server. Just prepare for how you might segregate these things and scale them later.
It's an interesting topic which we could spend many, many hours talking about, but David used the word segregation there, which is really about how you're choosing to divide up your many, many applications, which may have come from a really big enterprise service bus estate and all have been deployed in a monolithic way in a centralized architecture, how you can start breaking that up, teasing them apart into separate containers. And there's all kinds of choices that you might want to make in order to do that, which could be business driven, so particular lines of business, you might want to separate those apps into different servers, or at the very low level, they might end up being driven by technical factors or, dare we say it, licensing factors as well. And where that's concerned, we've also made some quite major enhancements recently around optimizing how an integration server can run.
Right, so this is all about server startup time, right? So do you want to take us through anything?
Yeah, so obviously, in containers, some of the key thing is about quick startups, so quick spin up of new releases. And sometimes you might find, depending on what you've got in your flows, it might take several, maybe minutes to start up if you've got huge message sets and things like that. And what you can actually do now is you can optimize your servers. So you can actually turn off bits of the functionality in the product. There's an IBM int optimize server command that you can actually run against your server once everything's deployed, and it will say, okay, right, I'm not using any HTTP nodes, I'll turn those off. Or I'm not using MQ nodes, I'll turn those off. So just makes server startup a bit quicker by turning off these things that you're not using.
And it'll generate a new YAML file, right? Server. YAML, right?
Yeah, it'll generate your configuration file, and again, that obviously components YAML file, that can go in source control, become part of your pipeline. There's a familiar theme about a lot of these new enhancements we brought out in the last 6 years.
And without wishing to oversell it too much, we have found that there are situations where it can dramatically reduce the amount of CPU that's needed in order to get your container starting, and starting very rapidly as well. So if you've done all the right steps, if you've pre-compiled particular artifacts into your bar file, you can actually get integration server startup. We always say in seconds, but we can even be sub-second in some circumstances. As a result of these changes with the optimize command, we're now in a position where we've managed to reduce the standard 0.3 CPUs that are needed to run a container right down to 0.1 in some situations. So it's 100 millis, great cost savings.
Yeah, and then if you're looking ahead to serverless, where you're not really running anything, everything's really just starting up as a message comes in, this focus on startup times and CPU costs and stuff really starts to become important.